is Olivia Cho, and I am in discussion section AO7 for Ethnic Studies 1R. I was born and raised in Tucson, Arizona for 18 years of my life, and I moved here for college. I am currently a second year at UCSD, a biochemistry major, going on the pre-med track. I am a second generation Asian American woman, and I grew up in a predominantly white and Mexican community. So I was predominantly exposed to white culture rather than much Asian culture throughout my growing and formative years. This perspective slightly changed after I moved out of my private Catholic middle school, which had a lot of people from the upper middle class, as well as people with parents of professional backgrounds and that were Catholic, and it was just a small crowd that I was exposed to, whereas when I moved on to my public high school, I saw people of various different backgrounds. I saw more representation of Tucson itself rather than a small community, and I saw people of different socioeconomic statuses, and it just kind of led me to appreciate this diversity that I could live in and understand different people's perspectives and be aware of the privilege or disprivilege that I myself carry. In a city that didn't really have Asian American representation, I felt kind of lost and that I didn't belong, that I was not, someone that was wanted, because the communities that I grew up in kind of made me feel different and exotic for being Asian, for eating certain foods, for looking a certain way. It all was racially derived, and it made me feel that I wasn't gonna ever belong, which kind of changed as I came to San Diego and saw much more Asian populations, and it just was a culture shock in general. Two immigrant parents kind of allowed me to expand my perception because they were financially stable through having professional fields and were able to afford to take me to visit my home countries and experience my culture and visit my relatives. So I'm grateful for that aspect of my upbringing. To unpack Week 7's key concepts, particularly California itself and its factors of isolation through its location and its plentiful resources, as well as its sources of labor. If we juxtapose the ways in which California developed labor-wise and economic-wise with their trade routes, and due to their isolation, they primarily used Asian labor as their source, whereas the East ports on the East Coast use a lot of indigenous populations, imported labor, but not specifically Asian labor, and slave labor. But that difference shows you why California has this history of, Asian American workers and in the working class, and kind of seeing how that difference in racial hierarchies, where Asians were the workers that were immigrants and imported in to fuel the economy. This resentment that was produced through the working class that were non-Asian, that were white, that saw these Asian Americans coming in as laborers and saw them as competition and as a threat to their own livelihood. Something interesting also is Sasaki's lecture specifically is how a white majority is the goal, and in Hawaii specifically, there was an Asian majority at one point and it was unwanted, and the white presidents in Hawaii were actually manipulating whiteness just to maintain that white majority because they felt like they were losing control, losing power. They did not want a minority of Asians to be taking over a land that they thought was an American and supposed to be white dominant location, which is an interesting trend, and you can kind of see that conflict between wanting this outside labor and minorities to come in for cheap pay, but then feeling threatened when they start to have, an existence in society and power and the ability to change things in society, because white supremacy was an issue and has still been an incessant issue. In the topic of globalization from week 10, and specifically how we see these pros and cons with this movement towards interdependence between nations rather than just a singular dependence of one nation on its own, is primarily due to the international trade routes that were growing, global relations becoming stronger, and we see capitalism expand amongst all these countries. And through this industrialization of these countries and expansion of trade routes and technological developments, there's a lot of economic prosperity and growth and a lot of good things coming out of this. However, there's also these caveats that Lisa Lau discusses in her text. She critiques the idea of globalization where social diversity is at risk because the more that cultures start to mix, the less diverse that they are and the more homogenous cultures worldwide become. And also social inequality and how discrimination can become rampant when there's so many cultures in one location, such as America, which is a good example because we experience a lot of social issues that maybe other countries with a homogenous culture don't. Over the years, the opinions on immigrants coming into the US have all fluctuated and gone from positive to negative, back and forth of being accepting and allowing immigrants to come, or setting quotas, or completely stopping the influx of immigrants of a certain ethnicity at all, like the Chinese Exclusion Act. And over the years, these changes have followed the social atmosphere that keeps fluctuating, where people begin to feel a threat of national security or a threat of too many immigrants coming in and not enough housing, not enough jobs and availability for them to actually live in our country. As an Asian American that is the second generation with parents who did immigrate to the US and did experience these maybe challenges by living, as an immigrant and not as a citizen for a while. And still to this day, immigrant policy can be an obstacle for many who want to reach that same level as an American, to be treated the same as an American. It helps me realize my own privilege as well, which I can apply when I'm existing in society and making decisions and voting. I can use that knowledge just to understand the disproportionality of immigrants and born Americans, because I am a born American and my parents were not. So that is the difference that I can now see because I've learned about this in this class, as well as just understanding my own mixed race and nationality and how my differences are seen elsewhere and they're understood, and maybe America has to undergo a change where we are not trying to categorize people but rather accept these new mixtures of race and nationality as the norm and not as different. Thank you for listening.